Maggie Thompson had always loved the idea of a close-knit neighborhood where people knew each other by name, shared stories over coffee, and helped one another in times of need. So when she moved into Willow Creek just 6 months ago, she felt hopeful that this quiet little community would be exactly what she was looking for. Willow Creek was a typical suburban neighborhood with neat rows of houses, well-kept lawns, and sidewalks where kids biked after school. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved hello from their porches and stopped to chat about the weather or the local school board meetings. But Maggie soon learned that there was more to this peaceful neighborhood than met the eye. The Homeowners Association, known as the HOA, was strict and very particular. Every few weeks, Maggie would find a note slipped under her door or taped to her mailbox. Sometimes it was a reminder about when to put the trash cans out. Other times it was a warning about small things, like the color of a fence or a flower bed that was too wild. The HOA rules were clear but detailed. No loud music after 9 p.m., no parking on the street overnight, no more than 2 cars per household, no clotheslines visible from the street, and absolutely no gatherings larger than 10 people without prior permission. At first, Maggie found these rules a little annoying. She wasn't used to such close supervision, but after a few months she began to understand why the rules were there. Willow Creek valued order and calm. The neighbors wanted their little piece of peace and quiet. Still, Maggie was a social person. She liked to laugh, cook, and make memories with friends and family. So, when she learned that her Uncle Charles would be visiting her for only one day, she decided to do something special. Charles was Maggie's favorite relative. He had been like a second father to her since she was a child. He always had a kind word, a warm smile, and a gentle way of making her feel important. But Charles was also a private man. He rarely talked about his work or the things he had done in his life. To Maggie, he was simply Uncle Charles, a quiet man who loved reading and gardening. Maggie wanted to show him a good time in Willow Creek. She thought, why not host a small backyard barbecue? Just a few close friends, some neighbors, and family. Nothing big, nothing loud, just good food and good company. She spent the week planning. She made sure everything would be perfect, and above all, she planned to keep everything within the HOA rules. Maggie cleaned her small backyard from top to bottom. She set up folding chairs and tables with bright checkered cloths. She hung fairy lights across the wooden fence, hoping they would make the evening magical without being too bright or noisy. She planned the menu carefully: smoked brisket, homemade cornbread, fresh lemonade, potato salad, and a small cake for dessert. She wanted to cook everything herself, to show Charles that she cared. A few days before the barbecue, Maggie went to the community bulletin board near the neighborhood entrance and posted a friendly note. Backyard BBQ, Saturday. 3 p.m. smoked brisket and homemade lemonade. All are welcome. Maggie, Lot 24. She hoped that maybe some neighbors might come by, even if just for a little while. The days passed slowly. Maggie found herself both excited and nervous. What if the neighbors thought it was too loud? What if the HOA sent a warning? What if nobody showed up at all? Her best friend Sarah tried to reassure her. Maggie, just be yourself. You're a kind person. People will come if they know you're being friendly. But the morning of the barbecue, Maggie woke up to a message from her next-door neighbor, Helen. Helen was a tall woman with sharp eyes and a serious expression. She always seemed to be watching everyone, and Maggie suspected she might be the unofficial HOA watchdog. The message read simply, HOA discourages gatherings over 10 people. Just FYI, Maggie sighed. She understood. She replied politely, thanks for the heads up. Helen, I'll keep it small. Helen didn't reply. As the clock struck noon on Saturday, Maggie was already in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on the food. The smell of hickory wood smoke filled the air. She smiled to herself, remembering how Charles had once taught her how to grill a perfect steak when she was a teenager. Slowly, the guests began to arrive. First, Sarah and her husband, Mike, showed up with their 2 children. Then came a few co-workers from Maggie's office. Some neighbors who had said hello in passing before but never really stopped to chat. Most surprising was when a couple from across the street walked over, carrying a small dish of baked beans and a bottle of iced tea. By 3 p.m., Maggie counted about 12 people in her backyard. More than 10, but still a small, friendly group. Charles arrived a little later than the others. He was dressed simply in a light blue shirt and khaki pants, carrying a small cooler with his favorite homemade lemonade. Maggie greeted him with a hug.
Uncle Charles!
You made it! Charles smiled warmly. Wouldn't miss it. As the afternoon stretched into early evening, the group laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the food. Children chased one another around the yard, and Maggie watched her uncle laugh for the first time in a long while. It was the kind of warmth she had hoped for. But not everyone was happy. Helen appeared again, standing by the fence with her arms crossed. She didn't smile or say hello. Instead, she looked directly at Maggie and said, "The smoke is drifting over my laundry, and I counted at least 14 people here." Maggie's smile faded. "Helen, I'm sorry about the smoke. I tried to keep the fire small. And I'm sorry if there are more than 10 people. I didn't want to make trouble." Helen shook her head. "The HOA rules are clear, Maggie. You should have asked for permission." Maggie felt her cheeks flush. "I did post a note on the bulletin board." "I thought that was enough." Helen's gaze was cold. "We'll see what the board thinks." Maggie didn't argue. She watched as Helen turned and walked back to her house, closing the gate firmly behind her. For a moment, the backyard felt quieter. The laughter stopped. Maggie looked at Charles, who gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll be fine," he said softly. But just 10 minutes later, the calm was broken by the flashing blue and red lights of a police car pulling slowly down the street. The car stopped right in front of Maggie's house. The flashing blue and red lights from the police car cut through the peaceful afternoon like a sudden storm. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest as the officers stepped out and slowly walked toward her backyard. The guests stopped talking, their laughter fading into quiet curiosity. The kids, sensing the seriousness, immediately calmed down and sat on the grass. Even Uncle Charles looked up from his seat, his calm face showing just a hint of concern. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and took a deep breath. "Hello, officers. Is everything okay?" Officer Daniels, a tall man with kind eyes, smiled gently. "We received a call about a large gathering here in Willow Creek. We just wanted to check that everything is all right." Maggie nodded quickly. "Yes, it's just a small barbecue for some friends and family. I didn't think it would be a problem." Behind Officer Daniels stood a younger officer, Officer Perez. She looked around carefully, noting the tables, the food, and the small groups of neighbors chatting quietly. The scene was peaceful, friendly, and clearly well organized. "I see," Officer Daniels said. He glanced at the crowd and then back at Maggie. "How many people are here?" Maggie counted quietly in her head. "About 12 or 13. The officers exchanged a look. Officer Daniels spoke slowly and kindly. "In Willow Creek, gatherings larger than 10 require permission from the HOA. Maggie nodded again, feeling a little embarrassed. "I did post a note on the community bulletin board to let people know. I wanted to keep everything respectful." Officer Perez smiled slightly. "It looks like you have made an effort." Helen, the next-door neighbor, appeared at the fence again. She folded her arms and stared at Maggie, her expression unreadable. Maggie felt a rush of anxiety but tried to stay calm. Suddenly, something about Uncle Charles caught Officer Daniels' attention. The older man was standing quietly by the lemonade table, watching the scene with calm eyes and a soft smile. "Sir, can I ask your name?" Officer Daniels said, stepping forward. Charles looked at the officer and replied in a steady voice, "Charles Reynolds." The name seemed to catch Officer Daniels by surprise. He blinked and looked more closely at the man in front of him. "Charles Reynolds? As in Justice Charles Reynolds?" Maggie's eyes widened. She hadn't said anything to anyone about her uncle's job. It was a private matter. But now the secret was out. Charles nodded. "That's me." The officers looked at each other again, this time with respect. Officer Daniels shook Charles's hand. "It's an honor to meet you, sir." Charles smiled kindly. "Thank you. I'm just here for some good food and company." The tension in the air seemed to ease a little. The officers stayed for a few more minutes, talking quietly with Maggie and Charles. They assured Maggie that they would inform the HOA about the gathering, but did not plan to take any immediate action. When they finally left, the blue and red lights disappeared down the street, and the backyard returned to its earlier warmth. But the silence did not last. Helen stood at the fence once more. Her eyes, sharp and full of judgment, swept over the guests. "I think you owe the neighborhood an explanation," she said coldly. Maggie felt a wave of frustration but kept her voice calm. "Helen, I wanted this to be a simple afternoon with friends and family. I didn't want any trouble." Helen shook her head. "You broke the rules. You could have asked the board for permission." Charles stepped forward. "Sometimes rules are important," he said gently, "but kindness and understanding are important too." Helen looked at him surprised. You are the justice?" Charles nodded. "I am. But today I am just a guest in my niece's backyard." For a moment, the two women looked at each other silently. Then Helen sighed and said quietly, "Maybe I was too quick to judge." Maggie smiled, relief washing over her. The small crowd around the tables began to laugh again, the tension slowly melting away. Charles took a glass of lemonade and raised it in a toast. To good neighbors and good food. Everyone raised their glasses, even Helen, who smiled faintly. The afternoon continued with stories, laughter, and the smell of barbecue filling the air. Maggie watched as her uncle shared quiet words of encouragement with her neighbors, reminding them that kindness could build bridges where rules sometimes built walls. As the sun began to set and the fairy lights twinkled softly, Maggie felt something new growing in Willow Creek, a sense of community, not just of rules. And in the quiet warmth of her backyard, Maggie realized that sometimes the best way to change a neighborhood was simply to invite them in for a meal. The flashing lights of the police car had stopped blinking as the officers stepped away, but their presence still hung in the air like a quiet storm. Maggie stood near the grill, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to calm her nerves. The warmth of the afternoon sun did little to ease the nervous flutter in her chest. Her guests, once chatting happily, had grown quiet. The laughter was gone, replaced by a cautious curiosity that seemed to freeze the air. Uncle Charles, standing near the lemonade table, looked over at Maggie with his gentle smile. "It will be all right," he said softly as if sensing her worry. Maggie nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the neighborhood's watchful eyes were still on her. Helen's stern glare from behind the fence did not help. Just then, a soft voice from behind made Maggie turn. "May I speak with you for a moment?" It was Officer Daniels, the taller one with kind eyes. He motioned toward the side of the yard, away from the guests. Maggie nodded, following him quietly. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, "I want to thank you for being so cooperative today. I understand you did not mean to break any rules." Maggie smiled weakly. "I just wanted to have my uncle here and share some food with friends. I didn't expect so many people and I didn't think it would be a problem." Officer Daniels nodded. "Rules are important, but so is community. That's what I saw today, a neighborhood coming together." Maggie looked down, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. "I just wish the neighbors could see me the way you do." He smiled. "Maybe this is the start of that." Meanwhile, back at the gathering, the mood was slowly shifting. Helen was standing near the fence, watching the guests carefully. Her arms were still crossed, but her expression was softer than before. She seemed to be thinking deeply. Maggie noticed her glance over and smiled warmly. Helen hesitated, then took a step toward the gate. "I brought something for your uncle," Helen said quietly, holding out a small wrapped package. Maggie took it, surprised. "Thank you, Helen." Helen gave a small nod. "I heard he likes apple pie. It's from my kitchen." Charles smiled gently when Maggie handed him the gift. "That's very kind of you." For a moment, the neighborhood fence didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a bridge. As the evening grew cooler, the fairy lights twinkled like stars above them. Children played quietly in the yard, and neighbors began sharing stories and laughter once again. Charles sat with Maggie and some neighbors, telling gentle stories about his childhood and the small lessons he had learned along the way. He spoke not as a Supreme Court justice, but as a man who valued kindness, respect, and understanding. "Sometimes," Charles said softly, "the greatest power we have is the power to listen, to see the good in others even when they make mistakes." The neighbors listened quietly. Even Helen nodded in agreement. Maggie watched her uncle and felt a swell of pride. She had always known he was special, but tonight she understood just how much quiet strength he carried. At one point, Sarah, Maggie's best friend, turned to her. "Your uncle is amazing. He's not just important, he's kind." Maggie smiled. "He always is." The night stretched on, filled with warmth and friendship. The earlier worries and fears seemed to melt away like smoke in the wind. Maggie looked around, at the people gathered in her backyard and strangers, just hours before, and felt hope. Hope that Willow Creek could be more than rules and letters. Hope that neighbors could become friends, and hope that maybe, just maybe, a backyard barbecue could change everything. As twilight deepened into evening, the backyard of Maggie Thompson's home in Willow Creek glowed softly under strings of fairy lights. The air was filled with the sweet smell of barbecue, freshly baked cornbread, and laughter that had returned to the gathering. After the earlier tension, it felt as if the neighborhood had found a gentle rhythm of warmth and friendship. Maggie stood near the edge of the yard, watching the small groups of neighbors chatting quietly with her Uncle Charles. The earlier events, the police visit, the complaints, the whispers of the HOA rules, now felt like distant memories, softened by the kindness that had spread through the yard. Uncle Charles sat at the picnic table, his posture relaxed, his face calm and kind. He was telling a story about his childhood in a small town, the way the seasons changed, and how neighbors would gather during autumn to share food and stories. Maggie listened with a smile. She knew her uncle had never liked to talk much about his work. But here, tonight, he was just a man surrounded by friends, sharing simple truths about life. Helen, her neighbor who had been so quick to judge earlier, approached slowly, holding a small plate covered with a napkin. "I brought this for you and your uncle," Helen said quietly. Maggie took the plate with surprise. "Thank you, Helen, that's very kind." Helen nodded. "It's apple pie. My mother taught me how to make it." Charles looked up from his seat and smiled warmly. "I would love to try some." Helen hesitated, then smiled. "Maybe I was too harsh earlier," she admitted. "I didn't understand the full story." Maggie's heart lifted. "It's okay. We all want the neighborhood to be a good place." Helen looked around at the others. "Your uncle? I didn't know he was so well known. A Supreme Court justice. I thought he'd be..." "Different," Charles laughed softly. "Different how?" Helen shrugged. "More serious, maybe, less friendly." Charles shook his head. "Being serious doesn't mean we can't be kind. The law is about people, about helping others. That's what matters most." The group fell silent for a moment, the words sinking in. Maggie felt a warmth in her chest. She looked at her uncle, proud to have him there, proud of the man he was. Later, as the sky grew dark and stars twinkled above, neighbors gathered around the picnic table for dessert. Maggie cut slices of the apple pie Helen had brought and shared them with everyone. The pie was sweet and warm, just like the night. Helen sat next to Maggie, her arms no longer crossed, her eyes softer. "Thank you for inviting me," she said quietly. Maggie smiled. "Thank you for coming." Charles looked around the table and said, "This is what community is about. Sharing food stories and respect, not just rules." One of the younger neighbors, a woman named Laura, nodded. "I think we all needed this." Maggie felt tears welling up but blinked them away quickly. The evening was quiet, peaceful and full of hope. As the guests slowly began to leave, thanking Maggie for the wonderful food and company, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Charles helped Maggie clean up the tables and chairs. "You did well today," he said softly. Maggie looked up at him. "I was scared it wouldn't go well." Charles smiled gently. "Sometimes fear only means we care deeply." Maggie laughed. "I cared too much about rules." He shook his head. "And that's why you cared about people too." The last guest left, and Maggie closed the gate behind them. She stood in the quiet backyard, the smell of smoked brisket still in the air, and looked up at the stars. Tonight, she had learned that truth and kindness could change hearts, even in a neighborhood ruled by rules. And as she turned to go inside, she knew this was just the beginning. The morning sun cast a soft, golden glow over Willow Creek as Maggie stepped out onto her front porch. The neighborhood was quiet, but there was a different feeling in the air, a sense of calm as if the day itself was holding its breath. Maggie thought back to the backyard barbecue the day before. The laughter, the conversations, and the way her neighbors had slowly come together despite the earlier worries. She smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Inside the house, the phone rang softly. Maggie picked it up, surprised to hear a voice she hadn't expected. "Hello, Maggie. This is Mr. Simmons from the HOA board." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. After everything that had happened, she wasn't sure what to expect. "I wanted to thank you for your cooperation yesterday," Mr. Simmons continued. "The board has reviewed the situation, and we agree that your gathering was well managed. We appreciate the positive spirit you brought to the neighborhood. Maggie breathed a sigh of relief. Thank you, Mr. Simmons. I'm glad to hear that. He smiled through the phone. In fact, the board would like to invite you and your uncle, if he's willing, to the next community meeting. We think it would be wonderful to have you both there. Maggie's smile grew wider. I'll be happy to come. After the call, Maggie stepped back outside and looked around the quiet street. Something had changed. The neighborhood wasn't just a place with rules anymore. It was a community. Later that afternoon, Maggie's Uncle Charles arrived for a short visit before heading back home. The two sat together in the backyard, enjoying a cool breeze and the soft sounds of birdsong. You handled everything beautifully, Charles said, taking a sip of his lemonade. Maggie shook her head. It was the neighbors who made it beautiful. I just invited them, Charles smiled. True, but it takes courage to open your door and your heart. Maggie looked at him thoughtfully. Do you think people can really change? Charles nodded slowly. Yes. Sometimes it just takes one moment. A meal, a conversation, a chance to see each other as people. Maggie reached out and squeezed his hand. Thank you for being here, he smiled warmly. Thank you for inviting me. The next week, Maggie and Charles attended the community meeting. The room was filled with familiar faces. Neighbors who had once seemed distant and guarded, now eager to share ideas and plans for the neighborhood. Helen stood up and spoke first, her voice steady. I want to thank Maggie for reminding us what Willow Creek can be, a place of friendship, kindness, and respect. Maggie felt her cheeks flush. The room burst into applause. The HOA board announced new plans to encourage more community events, block parties, gardening days, and neighborhood cleanups. The strict rules would remain, but with a new emphasis on understanding and communication. Over the following months, Willow Creek began to change in small but meaningful ways. Neighbors started leaving notes with invitations to coffee, help with gardening, or simply a friendly hello. Maggie often found herself sitting on her porch with a cup of tea, watching children play and neighbors chatting in the street. One afternoon, Helen knocked on Maggie's door, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from her garden. I thought you might like some, Helen said, smiling. Maggie welcomed her in, and the two women sat down for a long talk, sharing stories and laughter. The fence that once felt like a wall had become a meeting place, and Maggie knew that the backyard barbecue, the moment when police lights flashed and neighbors watched closely, had been the spark that started it all. As the seasons changed, so did Willow Creek. The neighborhood was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a community built on trust, kindness, and the simple power of sharing a meal. And in the center of it all was Maggie, a woman who believed in the goodness of people and the magic of a backyard barbecue.